there's lots and lots of different ways of telling the same story. So in my book, for example, two girls, in Bitter Chill, two girls are picked up in a car, and later that day only one of them is found. Now, children going missing is actually quite a common theme in crime novels, but each writer can tell the story completely different way. So I was sort of conscious that despite there being lots and lots of crime novels and I was following a big long tradition, actually there's lots of ways of doing it. At the same time, because I wanted to set my books in the Peak District, I was aware that Stephen has written this huge body of work set in the Peak District, which are excellent. So now I know Stephen's, and I got it wrong last time, but Stephen's main town is a made-up town, Edendale.
Correct.
Yeah. Eastbound. I call it Peter Robinson's time up there, Edendale. So his is made up, but he uses real life locations around the plot, and I'm sure he'll be talking more about that. He's used every good location in the Peak District. So, not wanting to be following Stephen's footsteps around the peaks, I just decided to make a composite town called Bampton. Because when you go to, who knows the Peak District? Who's been there? So a few of you know it. It's a place, as when you do a town, it's a place of different contrasts. I live between Buxton and Bakewell. Bakewell is very sort of, it's near Chatsworth House. It's like a touristy county type town. It's quite well heeled. Lots and lots of nice shops, a nice square and so on. Buxton, it's got a, I never say this in Buxton, but it's got this sense of faded grandeur. It's not the town it once was. It's got the buildings that are being regenerated. There's, you know, it's a town past its prime really, but it's still quite beautiful in its buildings and sort of sense of place anyway. And also other high peak towns. I went to the States and I was trying to explain what Derbyshire is like, and I said I live in a little village up in the hills, and people had this image of sort of Miss Marple, you know, St Mary Mead. It's not like that. It's more sort of Wuthering Heights, if anything. And a lot of the but a lot of the towns have a sort of industrial heritage as well. So Cromford Mill, where the Arkwright's Mill and so on. So I really wanted to make the industrial part of it in the town as well. So my town has a canal, which is that sort of nod to industrial heritage as well. So I make this composite town to try and bring in all these different sort of elements. So that's my town that I take through each book. Now, when I was writing the story, I did want to write a series, because I love series books. You know, we just love the Rebuses and the Bankses and so on. But I was also conscious that personally, I like standalones. So my favourite books are like Ruth Rendell's standalones. I like Minette Walters' The Ice House, you know, these sort of books where the story is complete by the end of it. So what I wanted to do was try and mix the two. So in all my books, I have a police investigation that happens every other chapter. So in Bitter Chill, it's based on an experience that happened to me as a child when I was walking to school and somebody tried to abduct me. In Bitter Chill, there's the two girls in the 70s are walking to school. One of them, they're both abducted, and later that day, one of them is found alive. In the book, it's then set in the present day, and the mother of the girl who was never found kills herself. And there's a police investigation into, well, what happened? Why is she suddenly killed herself now? But also, I like the idea of a standalone. So every other chapter is written from a different point of view, and that's the point of view of the adult, of the child that was found, who becomes an adult and becomes a genealogist. And so In Bitter Chill can be read as a standalone because you see her view of the investigation. She obviously does her own sort of looking into the past. So with A Deadly Thought, and what's quite interesting, when you write your first book, you think, I don't know what people are going to like about it. And what was quite good for me was when I wrote A Deadly Thought, I hadn't published the first one. So I had to sort of think, what do I like about it? And what will the readers like about it? And so I kept I kept the police characters, and they're in this new book. But then I've got a new story and a new protagonist that's told in every other chapter. Now, when I wrote In Bitter Chill, a couple of people, when it was published, said to me, little girls getting kidnapped. I don't really want to read it. I don't know if you've ever had this with any of your stories, you know, but they were like, oh, don't like the idea of children. And I thought, oh, fair enough. But I'd already written the second book by then. But my second book is a woman who smothers her husband in the middle of the night. That's the opening chapter. And then she goes to prison for 12 years for doing that. And then she is released. And then he turns up dead in a disused mortuary in Derbyshire. So she's gone to prison for killing somebody that wasn't her husband, but she has lied about his identity. So the investigation is, well, first of all, who did she actually kill? And second of all, who killed her husband in the present day? Now, what's quite funny is that nobody has a problem with a woman killing her husband. That nobody has ever said, oh, no, that's a bit... So obviously that's a much safer subject. But I do actually have quite strong feelings about victims. And it is quite unusual that often the victim isn't a middle-aged man. It's often a young girl or a child and so on. And it was quite interesting trying to make the crime interesting when it's a middle-aged man, because that might not sound very interesting as a victim. And, you know, there is a sort of type of victim, obviously. So, those are my two books. I think I'll leave it there, maybe move on to... Do you want to talk about yours, and then maybe we sort of swap? Yeah.
It's hello.
Hello.
It's always interesting to listen to other writers talk about how they started, and it makes me feel as though I'm a bit unusual, because I've always written, and when I say always, people often ask me now, how old were you when you started writing? And I can't remember. I was so young, it was pretty much as soon as I could read, I started to write stories. And I wrote my first novel when I was 12 years old. And when I look back now, I'm amazed that I did that. Anybody who's tried to write a novel, and I know some of you do, it feels like quite an achievement when you finish it, doesn't it? And it still feels like an achievement now. And I did it when I was 12. And you know, from that moment, when I finished that first novel at the age of 12, I knew that was what I wanted to do when I grew up. It felt so satisfying just to have finished that thing. So I dreamed from that age of just being able to do that, which I'm doing for you now, was to hold a book that had my name on it as the author. It just still feels like a thrill. Aren't I lucky to say I achieved that childhood ambition, because so few people do. And I figured out quite early on that you can't just leave school and be a novelist. You would starve fairly quickly. And I worked out that the way to earn a living by writing was to be a newspaper journalist, because that's what they did. And that was my first job. And strangely enough, my first newspaper job was in Cheshire. And I was living in South Manchester. That's where I started off. And I worked in local newspapers very happily for quite a number of years, but never forgot what I really wanted to do. And I came to the point where I wasn't happy in newspapers anymore, because journalism had changed so much over the years. I decided I wanted to get out, and this was what I was going to do. And hearing Sarah then talk about people having to try and find the time to write. I've never done anything else but write and edit for a living. I've never thought of doing anything else but that for a living. And some people, such as my wife, for example, would say I'm not capable of doing anything else for a living. That is all I've ever done, is writing. But when I came to start writing this series about my two Derbyshire police detectives called Ben Cooper and Diane Fry, the very first book I wrote, I didn't have a publishing contract. I'd written other novels which were still sitting in a drawer unpublished, and most of them still are now sitting in a drawer unpublished. I didn't know this book was going to be any different, but as a reader of crime fiction and a huge fan of crime as a reader, I simply sat down and wrote the sort of book that I would have enjoyed reading myself, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? That was the sort of book, it was called Black Dog, the first one. It was the sort of book that I would have enjoyed. But again, as Sarah says, you're always very conscious of what's gone before you, and certainly as a reader of crime fiction, you're aware of what's going on in the genre. And I decided to do something different from what I was reading at that time. I'm going back now to the 1990s when I started this series. I'd noticed, for example, that in a lot of the series I was reading, you know, we like to follow the same characters over a number of books, don't we? I'd noticed in the series I was reading then, the central character always seemed to be some world-weary, middle-aged, alcoholic loner. I don't need to name them, do I? You can think of a few. If you read crime fiction, you know who I'm talking about. And it was always a man, and he was always at least inspector or chief inspector rank, quite senior. And I thought to myself, why would I want to add another middle-aged alcoholic loner to the world of crime fiction? So that was why I decided to make my characters, my police detectives, they're young and they're junior police officers. So in the first book, Ben Cooper and Diane Fry were in the 20s, and they're detective constables. So they're right down at the bottom rung of the ladder in CID. Nobody was doing that at that time. And very interestingly, I've always known a lot of police officers, and when they began to read my books, they said, thank goodness somebody is writing a series of crime novels where the junior officers do all the work, because that's the way it is in real life. You know? And the other thing I'd noticed was there were certain expectations of a crime novel then. If it was set in a rural area, a village or a small town, you tended to expect something quite cosy. Do you know what I mean by cosy? It's where there's no blood, no violence, no sex, no swearing, nothing to upset you at all as a reader. And even the person who got killed didn't matter very much. You know, the murder is the trigger to start the puzzle, that Agatha Christie sort of country house tradition. If you go back and read some of those golden age mysteries from the 30s and 40s, the victim very often was somebody who was hated by everybody because they were such an unpleasant person, which does two things. It means that the rest of the characters don't have to spend much time grieving about their death. And secondly, it means you've got a huge cast of suspects because anybody could have bumped them off. And again, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to write about a rural area, but have a darker feel to it and deal with serious contemporary subjects through the characters. And, you know, the Peak District is perfect. It was an absolute gift for me when I started writing those books, because it has everything. It's got all those wonderful atmospheric locations that, and I've used quite a lot of them over 16 books, as Sarah knows. Fantastic range of locations in actually quite a small area, and thousands of years of history which go along with those places, and all the folklore and mythology. Some of that history you can actually see in the landscape. So you get stone circles, Bronze Age remains. You get the remains of the old lead mining industry, which changed the nature of the landscape quite dramatically in some.
Because, so I'm friends with quite a few Iceland. I like Scandinavian crime fiction, and somebody said to me once, if you do something wrong in Iceland when you're 19, nobody ever forgets because it's that small community. Well, it's not so different in small towns in England, you know, in the country basically. And so often, you know, you can use that small town environment to talk about sort of wider issues really. And we've talked about this in quite a few things because I think in that sort of environment, it's often secrets that everybody knows about, but nobody talks about it. And it actually happened to I sing in a choir, and in my next village, there's been a scandal recently about a family member who's gone to prison for incest. And half the village believe he did it with his sister, and half the village don't. I mean, and it's that sort of, you know, sort of splits up communities. But another Derbyshire writer who's based in Derby, Stephen Dunn, he writes about serial killers and so on. And you think, oh, well, that wouldn't perhaps work so much in a small town. But of course, we've had this discussion. It's perfect breeding ground for serial killers as well. As Harold Shipman operated not in Derbyshire but in small communities and so on. So you know, there's a lot you can mine from a small town as well, that people, when you're talking around the country, if you've grown up in that town, even if maybe you don't live that type of town, they understand the sort of dynamics of it, really.
That's very true. Now, I can remember talking about spree killings. You know, a spree killer who goes off and kills a lot of people all at once. They're very rare, but there was one a few years ago that happened in Cumbria. Do you remember this? It was in the news at the time, where this chap just couldn't take it anymore, and he got his shotgun and went off and started shooting people. He shot his brother first because he had some grievance over an inheritance, and then he shot the solicitor who'd been dealing with the case.
What was his name, sorry?
Kevin Commons.
Okay.
And then he went and shot some of his fellow, he was a taxi driver, and he went and shot some of his colleagues because he'd been having a dispute with them. And once you've started shooting people, there's no reason to stop, you know, and he went off and just shot people at random. And I was listening to that on the news. I was actually on my way to a prison, in Derbyshire, Sudbury prison, to do a talk for the prisoners. And I was listening to this on the radio, and the reporters kept saying this thing. Oh, it's beautiful part of Cumbria. It's the most unlikely place for this sort of thing to happen. And I was shouting at our radio. I was going to say, no, it isn't. It's exactly the sort of place where that happens. And if you think about the ones we've had, they're always small communities. You know, Hungerford, Dunblane, small communities. And it's because in a place like that, if you've got a grievance against somebody, you can't get away from them. You may see them every single day of your life, and it all kind of builds up. And I think very often when we have a murder in a rural area or a small town, very often the reasons for it are very complicated and involve all kinds of relationships, sometimes going back for generations. And that's much more interesting to write about and try and unravel, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. And as you said about the Peak District as well, it's a mixture of the cities as well nearby. I know that when everything goes wrong in my village, everyone blames that the Mancunians have come to the village, even though we don't. So it's like there must have been somebody from Manchester and so on. So there is that tension between what's happened, you know, at the local level and then the external as well, really. Yeah, it is interesting, and I think that there's been a move, really, probably started by people like Stephen, to use location as a kind of the driver, really, for the plot. So if you think like Anne Cleeves in Shetland, and to a certain extent the Vera and so on, certainly the books I was reading as a teenager, the sort of the countryside and so on was more of a background, whereas I think a lot more people, Ellie Griffiths, who sets her books in Norfolk, that it's actually intrinsic to the books, because your books couldn't really be set anywhere else. They're straight into the books, really.
And there is actually nowhere in the UK now that's too rural or too remote to have a series of crime novels set there, is there? You know, the Isle of Lewis, Peter May writes about the Isle. I don't think they've had a murder for the last century in real life, you know, but it's perfect setting because it's got all those relationships, and an enclosed community is very interesting to write about.
Yeah, I must admit, when I look for books in the library, often I read the splurge on the back, and I read about the location more than how many people have been killed and stuff in the whatever they give you on the jacket. And I think it's because, like what you're writing about, to me it's they're more kind of at risk because, you know, although London's only down the road, you know, it is kind of in this small area. They're independent. They're on their own sort of thing against the murderer or whoever, and that's what I find.
So you choose a book because of the location.
The location is a lot of it. I mean, then I start to find an author that I enjoy and then read more of theirs, but because they're right. the similar places, like Shetland, I've been, you know, with them and thoroughly enjoyed them. And just the something about being in an area that's cut off almost, but it's not, obviously, you know, because 5 minutes you're on the motorway and, you know.
So when I first started writing these books, I mean, 16 years ago, the first one, I thought I was writing murder mysteries, you know, which sounds a strange thing to say, but actually over the years I've had so many emails from readers, and so many readers have talked to me at events like this, that I know now that that's not what people are reading the books for. There are only 2 subjects which readers write to me about, and one of them is the characters. People like to get involved with the same characters over the books, so Ben Cooper and Diane Fry have become very, very important to readers over the years, and they pick up the next book to find out what happens next to Ben Cooper, you know. So that's one thing. And the other subject people write about is the locations. They've become very, very important, and which surprised me, really. But I know now that whenever a new book comes out, my readers, who are a little bit obsessive, some of them, will go out into the Peak District to try and find every single location that I've mentioned. Everyone, including the fictional ones. They'll try and work out from clues in the books. You know, it is become a real obsession. And it comes down sometimes to the smallest details. One of my books starts with a phone call, a threatening phone call made to the police, which turns out to have been made from a particular public phone box in a village called Wardlow, which is right in the middle of the Peak District. I know the number of readers who've told me that they've travelled out to Wardlow to look at the phone box. And, well, it's a nice red one, but it's just a phone box.
It's probably been decommissioned now, because our local phone box has just had a little notice saying you haven't, you know, it hasn't been used, low usage. It's the notice of decommission.
If that happens in Wardlow, people will be writing to tell me that, because they go. You see, what that is, I think, is that's a physical connection, isn't it, between the real world and this fictional world that people are reading about. It means you can go and stand in exactly the same place that Ben Cooper stood in that book, which puts people right there in the story. That's the value of those real locations, I think. People can actually go there and see and hear the same things that the characters saw and heard in the book. That makes a really very close contact between the reader and the author as you're reading.
But going back to the Isle of Lewis and so on, I think one of the reasons, I mean, prime readers I know read for lots and lots of different reasons, but one of the things I think often they read for comfort, don't they? And there's this idea in the Peak District, because it is inherently a safe place, you know, it's not an edgy place. I know it's got all this going on under the surface, but on a sort of, you can walk down the street and feel very safe. And it's this idea of sort of the serpent within paradise that you get with Scandinavia. It's one of the reasons Scandinavian crime fiction is so popular as well, because these countries are very low crime rates, especially Iceland, and they have lots and lots of, you know, sort of hideous crimes happening in their crime novels. When I lived in Greece, I lived in Athens, and it's a very edgy city. And, you know, there are some good Greek crime writers, but you expect a crime to happen in a sort of graffiti-ridden city and so on. And maybe sort of London-based as well. You know, you do expect, and it's the shock, really, of the lovely, quiet, bucolic countryside, and then this horrible thing happening that makes it so, you know, perfect, really.
I'll just pick up something you said earlier on, Sarah, about the victims. And if I'm a middle-aged man who's slightly difficult victim, I think it's something most crime writers are quite either conscious of or unconsciously know it, is that there's a sort of league table of victims. I don't write about children. I don't like reading about things happening to children, and I don't write about it. But my first book was called Black Dog, and I can remember when that was published in America, I had an email from a reader who said, "I see your book's called Black Dog. Before I read it, can you assure me that nothing unpleasant happens to a dog? And I learned that absolutely at the top of this league table, the victims who you won't get away with killing, your readers will get very upset with you if you do, are cats and dogs. If you kill a cat or a dog in your book, you will get hate mail. Seriously.
Does that include Hands of the Baskervilles, do you think?
No, I think it's the innocent victim, isn't it? I mean, that's what it is. And then next on the league table are small children. A lot of people don't like reading about horrible things happening to small children, including me. And then, and just won't read the book. And then after that, we've got older children, teenagers, who are a bit annoying, aren't they? So that's not quite so bad. and then you've got women. Now you see women, and a lot has been talked about this, and some people say it's quite misogynist and sexist that so many victims are female. Actually, I think it's the other way around, because I think the reason a lot of crime novels use female victims is that is still shocking. We're still shocked when a woman gets murdered. And it's not too shocking, it's not like killing a young child or a dog. But it's still shocking, it still has that impact on the reader, and readers care when the victim is female. Whereas down at the bottom of this league table, you've got men. Nobody cares what you do to men, right? And which is true. I mean, I'm sorry, gentlemen, it's true. I can remember I was well into the series, and I had an email from a female fantastic range of locations, and actually quite a small area, and thousands of years of history which go along with those places, and all the folklore and mythology. Some of that history you can actually see in the landscape, so you get stone circles, Bronze Age remains, you get the remains of the old lead mining industry, which changed the nature of the landscape quite dramatically in some places. So a lot of that history is actually there in the landscape for my characters to touch and feel as they go around the story. I like the fact that, I don't know if you know this, but the Peak District is the second most visited national park in the world, I'm told, beaten only by Mount Fuji in Japan. And that's because it isn't remote. It's not like the Highlands of Scotland. It has, if you look at a map, it has a ring of cities and large towns all the way around the national park. Manchester one side, Sheffield the other side, Nottingham, Derby, Stoke, all the way around it. And all those people in those cities treat it as their backyard. So that's why you get all those millions of visitors, and it creates inherent conflicts and pressures with the people who actually live and work there, and creates particular problems for the police. So a lot of the crime isn't committed by local people, but by travelling criminals. I'm told it's very easy to commit your murder in Manchester, say, and drive out into the Peak District to dispose of the body. Reservoirs, that's a good place. If you ever need that information, reservoirs are a good place for disposing of bodies. I've always thought the best thing about that is that the water from the reservoir goes straight back into Manchester. And it has all these things going for it, and I thought it was such a wonderful gift for me when I started writing those books to write about that sort of area. I'm from the Pennines myself originally, but from a bit further north in Lancashire. I was born in a town called Burnley and grew up on the coast in Blackpool, and I hated Blackpool for several reasons, but one of them was that I really missed the hills. It was when I discovered the Peak District. I was working in West Yorkshire and discovered the Peak District. I fell in love with that area, and I feel really privileged to be writing about it. I've written 16 books about Ben Cooper, Diane Fry and their colleagues, all set in that area. And you know what? The really wonderful thing is that these books, the Cooper and Fry series, are sold all over the world now. They do very well in the USA, for example, Canada, Australia. And we've got translations in 16 languages, including Russian, Japanese, Hebrew, all kinds of languages. And the fact is, much to my surprise, that the vast majority of my readers now are people who've never heard of the Peak District and have absolutely no idea what sort of place it is. And I'm introducing it to all those people. And I'm quite conscious of that when I'm writing now, because I'm trying to put them into the Peak District and make that experience what it's like. And it is it's a beautiful but dangerous place, is the way I think of it. If you go out onto those hills and you're not prepared, you can die.
And I mean, it's not just hill, but like the moorland as well, isn't it?
And the old mine workings are just being covered for decades and decades with these stone caps. People just disappear into the landscape, which I think is a fantastic idea. It's like the landscape is a living part of the story.
Yeah, because we lit the beacons. I can't remember. I remember it was the Queen's Jubilee. I think all the beacons were lit. So Chelmorton's one very high village in the Peaks, and so on Chelmorton Low, a low means a hill in Derbyshire. They lit a beacon. So midnight, I trotted up and sort of, with the rest of the village. It was a bit something like something out of Wicker Man, and we looked over towards there's a famous hill that leads into Cheshire called the Cat and Fiddle, and so we were all looking that way, because once that beacon was lit, it was a bit like Lord of the Rings, when they light the beacons along the hill. So we were waiting for the Cat and Fiddle to be lit, and then we saw the beacon lit, and then we lit ours, and and then we stood around and didn't really know what to do, and we went back down the hill. And then somebody said to me afterwards, there's all mine workings down the hill. I was just walking down in the dark. And they're probably not that well capped. I could have just disappeared forever.
Very easily. Yeah. It's interesting you're talking about that. One of my books was set up in the Longdendale Valley near Glossop. And it's the one I call it my pagan book, because there are a lot of strange customs and traditions that have survived in the Peak District. You might have heard of well dressing, which came from a pagan tradition of blessing the water. It's very important, and all kinds of other things go on there. And I wrote a book that had that as a sort of underlying theme, so it included well dressing and Morris dancers, but there's rather more sinister Morris dancers than you might be familiar with them. Not the Cotswold type, much more sinister, and a lot of pagan feeling to it, and symbolised by a vicar who, because people no longer went to church, his church was gradually disappearing under the ivy as it gradually grew over the church. And as I was writing that, I started to think, am I making too much of this? Am I pushing that a bit too far? And I picked up a copy of one of the local papers, the Glossop Chronicle. Glossop is one of those old mill towns. And to my amazement, they were having a Wicker Man ceremony in Glossop on May Day, where they paraded a Wicker Man through the streets and set fire to it in the car park of the Labour Club. No, it all happens still. Yeah. It still happens in Derbyshire. It's extraordinary, and it's all there under the surface, isn't it?
It is. So for the Deadly Thaw, I tried to incorporate, because I'm interested in the First World War, because of the centenary and so on. So I did a bit of research on the First World War in Derbyshire, which it's miles away from the trenches. You'd think there was nothing there. But what they found on the moors was that, so the Canadian Regiment, for a start, was stationed in Buxton. So when people were wounded the soldiers were wounded in the trenches of France, they shipped their injured back to Buxton Hospital. And Buxton was where Vera Brittain trained as well initially as a nurse, and she worked in the Testament Youth. But also they found these, the Coal Board did a survey of the moors to try and find out where the old mines were, to try and sort of make them safe. And they found a series of trenches And I think what happened was the soldiers were practicing digging trenches before going off to France. And you know, some of the stories there are amazing, but it's all sort of under the surface. And when you look at the war memorials, I mean, a lot of them are made out of the local stone, and they're just rough hewn bits of rock brought together. I think, you know, sometimes it's nice to go underneath what you're used to and you live and so on.
Some of those locations are incredibly atmospheric. There are a lot of aircraft wrecks on the moors, particularly from the Second World War, because the navigation systems were so primitive that if they got off track and they found a hill in the way, then that was it. And a lot of the wreckage is still lying there on the moors because it's so inaccessible to get to. And I can remember being up there one day, walking on my own over the moors, and it was misty. It always seems to be misty. and suddenly I found myself walking through this wreckage, aircraft wreckage. There was an engine, and then a wing, and another engine, spread for yards and yards right across this heather moor. It was just extraordinary. You start thinking about who the people were who died in those things. And some of the locations are just. There's in a town called Castleton, which you might have heard of. There's a big cave system. This is in the limestone area, the White Peak they call it, which has been hollowed out over thousands of years by the water. And the cave system goes on, I think, for 13 miles. That's what they've discovered so far. And that was an obvious location for me to use because caves are so frightening. If you go down there with one of the guides, they'll take you down to what they call the show caves, and they take you quite a way down, and then they turn the lights off. And that is proper darkness where you just can't see even your hand in front of your face. That is very frightening. But what really scared me, but also inspired a book, was when I heard this story about a young caver back in the 1950s when they were first exploring the Peak Cavern system. A young caver, he was only about 19, I think. He volunteered to go down into a narrow cleft to see if there was a way through. And there was kind of dogleg in the cleft, so he got down to the bottom, but couldn't get back up again. And their equipment was very primitive. They kept trying to pull him up, and the ropes kept breaking. And he was trapped down in this cleft. And they tried for 3 days, I think, to try and rescue that young man out of that cleft, and couldn't get him out. And he died while he was down there because he ran out of oxygen eventually and died. And because this was the 1950s, they had no equipment. They couldn't get him out. Do you know what they did? They walled him up and left him, and he's still there now. And the hairs on the back of my neck just
sounds like ghost
when I was down there and I heard this story, I thought, oh my, he's still there.
I know.
And you know, the thing that really struck me was one of the rescuers, the rescue party, an old man. He said that when they were working to try and rescue this lad, they were in a little chamber, and they couldn't see him because he was down there, but they could hear him breathing because the chamber acted as an amplifier, which meant that all of them knew the exact moment when he died because his breathing stopped like that. So scary, and that was. You can see where, when you're a crime novelist, those sort of ideas just kind of really stick in your mind and make you want to write about those things. And it's all there in the Peak District. I think
it is, and the beauty of it as well is that although you could use the landscape and the countryside and what you know about the Peak District, it also acts, I don't know if you find this, as a sort of everyday.
I can remember I was well into the series and I had an email from a female reader who said, why are all your victims always female? Like this accusation, you know, and I went, oh my God, are they? And I thought, is this something that I didn't realise about myself that's coming out in the books, you know? And I went through all the books that I'd written up to that point and counted all the people who died. And I discovered that not only had I killed exactly equal numbers of males and females, but I'd done that in each book. So that if there were 2 females killed in a book, there were also 2 males. I was quite proud of myself for that. That's a perfect gender balance without even thinking about it, because I didn't know it was going to be an issue. But why did that reader think that all my victims were female? Because she didn't even notice the men. She didn't care what happened to the men.
Yeah, it's true, because in Bitter Chill, it's funny what readers pick up on, because when you're sort of writing, you know, I didn't particularly think of the reader, certainly for the first book. I just wrote what I wanted to write myself. And then after it was out there, I thought, oh God, the men might pick up on this, pick up on that. And then what they actually write to you about is just completely what you didn't think of. So one woman wrote to me and said, I think you've got a weight issue. And I said, what? I thought, my photo's not that bad. She said, you describe, my main character in Bitter Chill is slightly overweight. And I explained that why, because she is the child that survived the abduction, and she comfort eats. Not massively, but she comfort eats. And she said something like, you describe her as a slight size 14 and a bit overweight, and, you know, I think you've been fat shaming. And I was like, you know, I really took offence at this. And I looked in the book, like you, and she said, you describe the women in terms of their appearance and not the men. And I thought, do I? You know, because again, you think maybe I do. Maybe I describe what the women are wearing, and the men are just, you know, tall and blonde or whatever. And I looked, and I had done it for both of them, but it's what she really picked up on was the descriptions of the women that she took offence with.
It's more about the readers than the...
It's all about the readers. The one thing you learn is that every reader is different. And if you look at reviews on that, readers' reviews on Amazon or somewhere, you'll see that one reader will absolutely love a book for some particular reason, and the very next reader will hate it for the same reason. And the book hasn't changed in between reviews, it's the reader that's changed. And everybody brings their own experience and their own likes and dislikes and personality traits to the reading of a book, which is fine, but it means that you get all these strange and odd responses, which, really? I can remember one lady who complained about my police characters. She said they use very working class terms, you know, the vocabulary is very working class. And she said, and some of them haven't even been to university. And I went, have you ever met a police officer? But she obviously had some image in her mind. You know, Inspector Morse,
Yes.
of these very, very intellectual and terribly well-educated police officers, you know, which was that was her only experience, I think, of the police.
Do you read your reviews on Amazon?
Yeah, I love them because, you know, they don't tell me anything about the book, but they tell me a lot about my readers. Sometimes you get a really good insight into the mind of a reader. It can be quite shocking, actually. I remember there was my first book, Black Dog, an American reader wrote this, and he said, this is the worst book I've ever read. In fact, I've read it twice now, and it's still the worst book I've ever read. Why, if you hate a book that much, why would you even finish it the first time, let alone read it twice? And I thought, this is some kind of literary masochist, you know, just enjoys punishing himself. I think that's quite horrifying, isn't it? These are readers.
I just find with reviews on Amazon and Goodreads, you know, if a reader loves it, you get 5 stars and just like excellent, or, you know, love the book. If they don't like it, you get 2 stars and like a long essay on why they don't like it, and it's quite strange, that sort of critical eye, really.
And a lot of readers, of course, don't understand the rating system. They sometimes don't realise that they're supposed to be rating the book. They're rating Amazon, you know. So, oh, the book arrived promptly and well packaged. I haven't read it yet. 5 stars. Thanks.
Are you affected by what your writers say when you write your next one?
What readers
Does that
say?
influence you in any way?
No, because I think the time lag is such, for me anyway, I've had to deliver the next book before the first one's out, before the one before is out. So I've just delivered book 3, so it would only be influenced by what people have said about the first book, and I know I've sort of moved on anyway. So no, not particularly. I mean, I do find, it's a bit like that. It's conflicting, but then that's why I don't send my books out when I'm writing to many readers. I have one reader that I trust, and before I send it to my agent and editor, I send it to her. But other than that, because actually it's just book 3's just come back from my editor and agent, and they both had completely different comments on it. So that's at the professional level. So you've just got to sort of trust your own instinct, really. I think to a certain extent.
I found that very much so, particularly with because I've got these 2 characters, Ben Cooper and Diane Fry, and the relationship between them is quite a complicated one, I think it's fair to say, over 16 books. And readers build up their own scenarios, their own ideas of what's going to happen next. And so I find that a lot of readers will write and say, when are Ben and Diane going to get together? and then the very next reader will write and say, I hope to goodness they never get together because they're so wrong for each other. Well, you can't pay attention to that. You can't let readers influence you. I think what you have to do is just have the trust in your characters, and let them do whatever feels right for them when you're actually writing the book. You put all that stuff out of your head, and the characters are doing what they want. And you just have to accept the fact that some readers won't be pleased by whatever you write. Some will and some won't, and that's just the way it is.
At least they bought the book.
Yes.
Or borrowed it.
I got myself into big trouble in one of my books where a character died at the end. And I actually didn't know it was going to happen. It quite shocked me when I wrote it. Like, oh my goodness, I'm in trouble now. and a lot of readers have really built up a kind of a whole future for that character. And when that character died, they were just distraught. But that's fantastic, isn't it? Because readers are reacting to the characters as if they're real people, which is what we're trying to achieve when we're writing the books. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think it is quite hard to achieve the sort of will they, won't they. It can get wearying with some things. I mean, I tell you who does it really well is Ellie Griffiths. If you read her books, the sort of the Ruth Galloway, Harry Nelson dynamic. It's sort of, they keep getting together and then not, but it just works really, really well, I think. But then I think you have to do it to a certain extent, because I know I've stopped reading when the 2 get together and I think, well, that's it then. The dynamic, I'm not interested in it. They've got together.
Yeah. But I love the fact that readers respond to the characters as if they're real, because they're real to me in my head. I'm sure they are for you, Sarah. And Ben Cooper has become this character who a lot of readers really love. They've fallen for Ben Cooper in a big way. Some of my readers, because he's a nice bloke, and he's got his own ideas of what justice is, his own real, humanity and compassion. Which a lot of readers really love. And I can remember, again, an American reader. I don't know if any Americans in the audience.
A bit late now.
This sounds like a cliche, but American readers, how can I put it, tend to be a bit over-enthusiastic, just go a bit over the top, And a lady wrote to me once and she said, I think Ben Cooper is the most wonderful human being I've ever met. I was going, calm down. Isn't that amazing? She not only feels she's met him, but he's the most wonderful human being she's met. I just think it's such a privilege to be producing things that get that sort of response from readers.
Do you think you ever stop writing Brian Cooper? And if so, how would you end it? Because I mean, some people have been quite controversial and killed their main characters off when they finished their book.
I'm seriously thinking of retiring and just letting Sarah writing about the Peak District. I think that'd be fine. But if at some point, I think with any series, there comes a point when you should just, if you've lost interest in the characters, perhaps, you should stop. And I'm only going to carry on writing about them as long as the characters are still moving forward and things are happening and I'm interested in what's going to happen next. I'll keep writing about them. But I will stop at some point. I couldn't possibly kill Ben Cooper or Diane Fry, I don't think, even though she annoys me sometimes. Because they're all friends now, they've lived inside my head for 16, 17 years. And I don't know how you just kill something like that because you got bored with it.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I'm early in the series, so I don't have a sort of... When I wrote In Bitter Chill, I didn't know there would be a sequel. I did write it as a standalone with police in it. And so I got to like the police characters. And so I've moved them on. But I am going through the season. So then I envisage, maybe a quartet, because In Bitter Chill set in the winter and A Deadly Thought set in the spring. And the one I've just written is set in the summer. But I know the police, as you say, the relationships and so on won't be finished for book 4. It's not working out like that. Quartets or whatever. I do feel I'm quite early on in terms of the series and so on, so I'm not sort of thinking about killing off my characters yet. Although there is one character that lots of people don't like, and I don't think your readers have to like every character. I think it's nice to have a character you don't like, and people write to me and say they don't like this character. And he's making a sort of gradual exit, but not because he don't like it. It's just characters then to develop a sort of... They act as they should act, and I think this person would be quite ambitious and would move, would go on to bigger and better things. And that's funny how characters actually start to take a life of their own, and they do things. You have to write what you think they would do rather than just keep them confined in your book, So one of my characters is naturally sort of going elsewhere.
But obviously, if you're promoting that character, you can bring them back later at a higher position and be an irritant to your main characters.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Ben Cooper had a girlfriend in the first two books, and I didn't like her, not because she was an unpleasant character, but she wasn't very interesting, and I wasn't interested in writing about her. So he actually, in a scene where he gets called to a crime scene and he leaves her in a bar somewhere, and she never appears again. It's like he just left her and forgot her. And I just sort of, in my own mind, I'd written her out because she wasn't an interesting character, and readers kept asking me for years afterwards, what happened to Helen? She's still sitting in that bar somewhere.
She's turned up as a murderer somewhere,
But whereas conversely, one of the secondary characters called Gavin Murphy, who's kind of old school copper that Ben Cooper works with, he appeared in the 3rd book in the series, very small part, and I loved him. I thought, Gavin, he's a really interesting character, reminded me a lot of some of the old coppers that I used to know, and he's gradually become more and more important as the series has gone on, and he's the one who readers write to me about a lot now, and would quite like some of them for Gavin to have his own series, because he's just become such a living, breathing character. And that's the way it works, that creative process. Sometimes they take on that life of their own, which you didn't really plan for them.
Have you ever been tempted to take your characters out of Peak District in Derbyshire? And put them somewhere else? I know 1 or 2 authors do that and then regret it and take them back again. But have you ever been tempted to?
Not yet. I was conscious that In Bitter Chill was quite closed in, and I did want it A Deadly Thought to be slightly wider. So not the police, but the protagonist goes to Whitby, so part of the...
That's a long way.
Sorry?
That's a long way.
Oh no, Whitby, yes, yeah. There's a slight Hammer theme going in in the book as well. My teenage protagonist watched a lot of Hammer films, and of course Whitby's got the Gothic connection, so there's a little bit of Gothic in it as well. So they go to Whitby, but that's not my police. It's more, you know, the characters go elsewhere, and only because I didn't want it to be as closed in. In winter we get cut off in our village, so it is very closed in. I wanted spring just to move out, but saying that, book 3 is back all in Derbyshire. I don't think I would want to move them out.
I've used cities, because there are cities around very close to the Peak District, so I think over the course of the series they've visited Sheffield, Manchester, Derby, and Diane Fry is actually now based in Nottingham, because she works for the East Midlands Major Crime Unit, so Nottingham has come into it. And I did actually once send her to Ireland as well, as you recall. And she, Diane is although Ben Cooper is the local boy who grew up in the Peak District, he's from a farming family and knows the area. Diane is the classic outsider, which you get a lot in crime fiction. It goes back to the old westerns, doesn't it, when the outsider comes into the town. And she's a city girl, and she comes, in this case, she comes from Birmingham. And I have sent her back to Birmingham 2-3 times, I think. And I actually quite like that contrast between the Peak District, the rural isolation of the Peak District, and the city. You know, such different areas in a lot of ways, but some of the issues can be quite parallel. So I do use cities sometimes.
Has anyone got another question?
Was it difficult getting published?
I thought it was quite difficult, but I think the process was quicker for me than some people. So I came back from Greece with a crime novel, and I was working on it, and I did a few things that I probably would recommend and some I wouldn't. So I went on an Arvin course, if anyone's heard of the Arvin Foundation. They run week-long courses for people. I went on that. I had a finished book by then, and I was with people who were still, you know, early on in their writing. But it was good, and I met lots of contacts there. So I'd recommend that. Then I paid for a manuscript assessment. I don't know if you've heard of those. It's where you send your manuscript off and somebody assesses it. I wouldn't recommend that, because the person who read my book didn't like it, and I didn't think that the comments she made were... I don't think she liked crime fiction. I think it was sent to somebody who clearly didn't like crime fiction. But it was really, really good for me, because when I got her comments back, they were quite detailed. And I remember thinking, I've read enough, I'm not going to change that. So some things I took on board, and some things I didn't. And then I met my agent at a party, because I was going to crime fiction do's because of my blog. I met somebody and I was talking about my blog, and she got in touch with me afterwards and said, "Are you writing?" And I said yes, and I sent her the manuscript, and she said, "Don't send it to anyone else." So I got an agent really quickly. But then with publishing, you then get your manuscript is sent out to all these different publishers, and you know, you get lots of rejections basically. People say no, 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 and then it was Faber said they were interested. So I mean, that was great, and that whole process, maybe from the agent to getting a publisher, was 6 months, which is really, really short. But behind that, there was about 4 years of being in Greece, writing, doing the manuscript assessment, going on an Arvin course. I had 4 years of leading up to that. So it was like 4.5 years, which isn't as much as some people, I appreciate. So the process of actually finding someone was very short, but there was quite a lot of back work, if that answers your question.
I never did any courses. Nobody ever taught me how to write. The funny thing is that I now teach other people to write. But when I decided I wanted to get out of newspapers, I was very single-minded about it, and I think you have to be to get. You know, I wanted to be commercially published, because I wanted, and this was the dream, I wanted to give up the day job. I wanted to get out. So I wanted my books to be earning a living for me, which actually, and I didn't realise this at the time, it's actually a very difficult thing to achieve. So I was writing and writing and writing in the evenings when I came home from work, because I had very limited amount of time to write in. I made the best possible use of it. I was writing every single night into the early hours of the morning. And I'd set myself goals. I was in middle management, so I had goals, you know. And my first goal was to get myself an agent, because everybody told me to be successful in publishing, you've got to have an agent first. And my second goal, medium-term goal, was to get my first book published. And then my long-term goal was to, after several books were published, I might be earning enough money to give up the day job. And that was the way I planned it. I got my agent very quickly, just by going through the books, you know, the Writer's Handbook, the Writer's Knowledge Yearbook, finding agents who were interested in crime fiction and making a list of them and just sending samples of my work out just constantly to people and getting all those rejections. So, until an agent found some promise in what I was writing and was willing to sign me up and work with me. And she sold my first book, Black Dog, and that, I can still remember that very clearly, because that was the moment when my life changed. She rang me up one day. She ran an auction between 3 major publishers. We had HarperCollins, Hodder Headline and Penguin. Penguin were the first ones to offer for that book. And she rang me, and I was working at my local newspaper doing something very boring. And she rang me up from London and said, "We've just had an offer from Penguin for your book." And I went, wow, you know, Penguin, who were one of the most famous publishers in the world, want to publish my book, and they're going to pay me for it as well. It's like this amount of money she mentioned. But the big difference here in having that agent was that she said, "No, we're not going to accept that offer," which I would have just snatched the hands off, you know. She said, no, we'll not do that. I'm going to run the auction. And she had publishers bidding against each other for that book over about a week. And it was very strange, because it was almost as if it was nothing to do with me. It was going on down here in London. And she would phone me occasionally and say, "Well, Headline have bid this amount of money, but HarperCollins will go higher than that." You know, so, and I was going, "Fine, carry on." And in the end, I signed a 2-book deal with HarperCollins, who assumed that I was writing a series. I'd only written 1 book, but they'd assumed it was a series. And I had to hastily write a synopsis for the 2nd book overnight and send it to my agent next morning, and that's what clinched a 2-book deal with HarperCollins. And literally, and I'm astonished when I look back now, because I was so naive, I didn't realise this. From that moment, I was earning enough money from that contract to give up the day job. So my long-term goal just came whizzing down the line at me, and I went, "Wow, is this what it's always like?" You know, and it isn't. It isn't. I was just so lucky from that moment. And I think that's what a lot of it is luck and timing. I moved house quite recently, and I cleared out my old filing cabinet. And I had a rejection letter from HarperCollins, who subsequently went on to publish 10 of my books. And I'd just sent them the wrong book at the wrong time. And when I sent them my agent sent them the right book, that made all the difference.
It's true, because I sent my first chapter off to a competition in Stylist magazine, which was being run by Faber, and never got anywhere, never heard anything. And then 6 months later, it's bought by Faber. You know, the person who bought it was judging the competition. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. So it was just really, really strange that, you know, I was in a run trying to get in a competition and got nowhere, and yet the same person who only bought 2 books that year from authors, you know, chose mine. It's quite strange.
It is odd, and if you get rejected, if you've been sending out material to publishers and keep getting rejected, it isn't necessarily a reflection of your ability as a writer. You might just have sent the wrong book at the wrong time, or you might have sent it to the wrong person. Editors change constantly, and they have their own personal likes and dislikes.
Do you think they pay more attention when it comes through an agent?
Oh, yeah, certainly, yes.
So you think there's already somebody professional involved with that?
Well, there are agencies, and there are different kinds of agencies, but certainly my agent she's pretty much a one-woman business. She's the agent. And those type of agencies make their business by finding new talent and building them up. And she's developed a great reputation for doing that. So she's been very successful at it. So when she goes to a publisher now and says, I've got a new author, everybody takes notice of it. So that's the sort of agent you want when you're first setting out. It does make, and it made just financially, it made a huge difference to me that she knew the business so well. That she sold the American rights separately and all the translation rights separately. Whereas your publishers really, they want to grab everything. They want world rights, as they call it. And if it's just left up to you, and you don't know much about the businesses, I didn't, you would just say yes to everything. But agents say, no, we'll not do that. So it's better this way.
So she earned her commission.
Yes. Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah, she's earned every penny of it, yeah. And it is quite a lot of money she's had off me, right?
There's somebody at the back. Yeah.
Stephen, have you had any offers from film and TV?
Gosh, how long have we got? Film and TV, I saw the TV option for that first book almost straight away when it's published, or my agent did. And at the time, it felt like wonderful. This is the big time, TV. But an option is only that, they've got their name on it for a year, and they might or might not do anything with it. And in this case, the option lapsed, and it just disappeared. And year after year, when a new book came out, somebody would be interested in doing them for TV. And I got so fed up with it. Sounds terrible, I know, but my agent would phone up and say, oh, we've had the BBC on today, they're interested in Cooper and Fry. And I would go, oh yeah, again. And it never happened. A few years ago, we got quite close with Sky, who were putting a lot of money into creating a new drama series. And we were contacted by a production company who'd been commissioned by Sky to make a crime drama series, and they wanted to do Cooper and Fry. It was great. And we got quite a long way down the road. We had the finished script for the first episode. The producer and the script writer had been up to the Peak District, and I'd taken them all around the locations. And the financial crisis came along, 2008 was it? And Sky just turned around and said, actually, we can't afford to do it now. And it disappeared again. And right now, at this moment, we're in development, as they call it, for a TV series, ReadFest. Fantastic production company, have got the rights. We've got another script for the first episode. And we're just at that point where we're waiting for the commission. It's so expensive making television drama, you wouldn't believe how expensive it is. So we're waiting for the TV network to just say, right, here's the money, go and do it. And it takes so long. Actually, I've got to a point where I'm just not worrying about it, because it won't be anything to do with me. I think it's just better leaving the people who know how to make good television, which they do, and just letting them get on with it. And I'm just going to keep writing books, and if it happens, it happens. But people ask all the time about TV. It's kind of a validation of your books, isn't it? People say, oh, has anything been on TV? Have they been on TV? Not yet.
What about radio, Sarah? Do you think your books would be suited for sort of drum station radio?
I guess so. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've not listened to my audio. I find it really hard to listen to anybody reading my books. I mean, I can read out my extracts, no problem. But I've had the audios through, and I can't listen to them. There's something about it, I just can't do it. So I don't know.
I was thinking like the Woman's Hour drama, I was thinking ideal.
Yeah. it's one of those things like what Stephen was saying about the agent. So my publisher had the audio rights, so if it went to, you know, sort of the drama and so on, I think it'd go through them, whereas my agent has the film and TV. I mean, she gets a lot of interest, but because I've only got 2 books, they're often looking for a sort of series and so on. So we'll wait and see. Yeah.
It's a whole different world, you know. It's so strange, you know. When you're writing books. It's such an unreal world, TV and film. Well, there was one of my books. It was called One Last Breath. It was one set in the caves, Castleton. And in America, it had a really good review in a publication called Entertainment Weekly, which is the one that all the TV and film people read, apparently. It was their 5-star review of the week or something. And, you know, the phones were suddenly red hot with people phoning up from Hollywood Boulevard, you know, so what's the status on this book? And we sent out all these copies of book. And I said to my agent, look, they've no idea what sort of book this is. What they react to is the buzz. If it's a book that people are talking about, they want to be the ones who get it first. So we sent all these books out and there was just dead silence. And it's bizarre the way, you know, talking to TV producers, you realise what a different world that they operate in from the world that we do. It's really strange.
Talking about America, I remember when I was 15, some of the first books I read was some of the Mike Hanna series, the Mickey Spillane, and they were some of the first books along with James Bond that I, after leaving school, that got me reading and eventually carried on as an avid reader. Do you think now our crime writing has now overtaken or equaling anything that Americans do, or is there no such, you know, you don't, nothing to consider, you just write and that's it? But as a genre in general, do you think British crime writing is superior or anything? Or
superior? Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, as a woman writer, I think what's interesting is you feel like you're following in a massive tradition of really great British crime writers. So, you know, the Golden Age crime writers. And I feel I'm writing in that tradition in terms of that's the type of book I write, and possibly you as well. I mean, I don't come from the noir tradition of Philip Marlowe and so on. And there are some great British crime writers who are clearly coming from that noir tradition. As I don't see it as necessarily competition, but I don't see it as something that I'm, you know, following. I think British crime writing is brilliant. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's as good. But then I like American crime writers as well. And then there's crossover because Lee Childs. I mean, he's a British crime writer, but his books are set in the States.
They are different, aren't they? I think what we do. So say we, you know, modestly, is really well in British crime fiction is character-driven novels, which is what I like to read. And then I, you know, for me as a reader, all the great classic British crime writers were female. You know, Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers and P.D. James, Ruth Rendell was one of my great heroes, and Minette Walters. I was reading her books when I started writing these. And they were writing about the sort of things that I was interested in, character and relationships. And I've heard a lot of my male contemporaries say they were influenced by Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. But I could never get into those books. They just didn't appeal to me at all as a reader. And I think it's true of a lot of American crime fiction. I mean, they don't even use that term, crime fiction, very much in the States. You have these mysteries, which are the cosy end of the market, and thrillers, you know, and they're two quite distinct things. And a lot of British crime fiction doesn't really fit into that market. But there are some who write really good character-driven crime fiction. I mean, the one I think of is Michael Connolly, Harry Bosch series. I think it's fantastic. So there are some standout exceptions, but a lot of that American stuff is just too plot-driven thriller for me.
I mean, I was quite influenced in my 20s by these sort of women writers like Sarah Paretsky, the V.I. Wachowski novel, Sue Grafton, who's written the A to Z. A is for alibi, B is for burglar. I mean, they were quite, they felt quite innovative when I was when I was reading, because they had this sort of female PI go-getter and so on that I hadn't had in the golden age and the British crime fiction tradition. So I would say I was quite influenced by those women writers, women PI type books, but less so now, I would say. I've never read any Michael Connolly, and people cite him as this. I must do.
Really good, strong central character. Laurie King, I don't know if you know her. She had a terrific series about a female police detective in Los Angeles, I think it was, called Kate Martinelli, and then she started writing these Sherlock Holmes things, not about Sherlock Holmes, but about a female character connected to Sherlock Holmes. And that I have a bit of difficulty with, writing about somebody else's character. I was kind of doubt.